Harlem, 1957. Someone spat in Mamie Johnson's face and spent the night laughing. Her husband, Bumpy Johnson, spent that same night making 4 phone calls, cold, silent, and precise. What did Bumpy do in just 13 minutes that made the most powerful crime family in New York choose to look the other way, to understand how it all led here? We go back to where it truly began. The morning of Sunday, October the 13th, 1957 began the way all mornings in Harlem began, with the sound of the city assembling itself back into existence. After a night of noise and darkness and the particular exhaustion that follows a Saturday lived at full volume. Garbage trucks groaned on distant avenues. Pigeons argued on fire escapes. The smell of coffee drifted from kitchen windows, where women in housecoats stood watching the street below, with the practiced patience of people who had learned that whatever the night had produced, the morning would eventually reveal. Wilbur Jenkins was 53 years old and had worked the same sanitation route on Lenox Avenue for 21 years. He knew every alley, every dumpster, every shortcut between buildings, the way a pianist knows the keys by feel, by habit, by the accumulated memory of 10,000 repetitions. He turned into the narrow passage behind La Stella at 6:06. His orange vest catching the pale pink light of a dawn that was still deciding whether to commit to the day. His breath visible in the cold air that had finally arrived with the small hours of the morning. He stopped 7 steps into the alley, not because of what he saw, because of what he felt. The particular stillness that certain discoveries produce. Not silence exactly, but the absence of something that should be present. A vacancy in the air that the body understands before the mind catches up. He stood without moving for 4 seconds. 5. 6. And in those seconds, the sounds of Lenox Avenue, the trucks, the pigeons, the distant radio seemed to recede to the far end of a very long tunnel. On the lapel of what he found, pinned with the careful precision of someone who had thought about placement, was a small rectangle of white cardboard. 7 words, handwritten in block letters so neat they might have been typeset. He read them once, then he read them again. Not because he had failed to understand them the first time, but because some sentences require a second pass to confirm that they are real, that the world you are standing in is the same world you inhabited 30 seconds ago. 7 words. The note was gone by the time the detective arrived. The detective would later claim he had never seen it, but those 7 words traveled through Harlem that Sunday morning faster than any newspaper could have carried them. Passed from mouth to ear in the particular frequency of a neighborhood that had learned, over generations, to communicate the things that mattered in the spaces between official accounts. Every person who heard them understood immediately, without requiring explanation, what had happened in the hours before dawn, and why, and who, and the singular chain of events that had begun. Not with violence, but with something far smaller and far more consequential. A pearl earring, the size of a marble, the weight of a feather, and heavier, in the end, than anything else in this story. To understand the note, you need to understand the earring. And to understand the earring, you need to go back 11 hours, to a Saturday evening that began the way all of Mamie Johnson's Saturday evenings began, with the smell of Chanel No. 5 and the sound of Langston Hughes being read aloud in a room where 4 telephones sat silent as sentinels against the wall. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was 51 years old in the autumn of 1957, and he was, by any measure that Harlem recognized as meaningful, the most powerful man north of 110th Street, not powerful in the way that politicians are powerful, or businessmen, or men whose names appear in newspapers above the fold. Powerful in the older, more fundamental sense the sense that the ancient streets understood before laws were written and courtrooms were built. His name, spoken at the wrong volume in the wrong establishment, could empty a room in 40 seconds. His displeasure, communicated through nothing more than a particular quality of silence, had resolved disputes that lawyers had argued for months. 3 decades in the machinery of Harlem's underground economy had produced in him a reputation so dense, so thoroughly woven into the fabric of the neighborhood, that it functioned less like a personal attribute and more like a geographical feature, something you navigated around, the way you navigate around a river or a mountain, acknowledging its presence not as a choice but as a simple condition of existing in that landscape. On this particular Saturday evening, however, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson looked like none of these things. He sat in the armchair by the window of the apartment on 150th Street between 7th and 8th Avenue, wearing a burgundy silk robe over a white undershirt, leather slippers that Mamie had given him for their 19th anniversary, and a pair of reading glasses perched on the bridge of his nose that only 4 people on earth had ever seen him wear. In his hands, open to a page he had read so many times the spine had memorized the angle, was a collection of poems by Langston Hughes. His lips moved slightly as he read. This was his secret, the one that would have scandalized every soldier in his organization and confused every rival who had spent years constructing a mental portrait of a man incapable of softness. Bumpy Johnson mouthed poetry when he read it, not because his literacy required it, because the rhythm of the language deserved to be felt in the body, not just processed by the mind. 4 telephones sat on a small table against the hallway wall, 4 separate lines running into 4 different corners of a criminal empire that generated more money in a single week than most legitimate businesses on Lenox Avenue earned in a calendar year. On any given weekday, those phones rang constantly, a percussion of obligation, dispute, demand, and loyalty that composed the daily soundtrack of running an underground kingdom. But on Saturday evenings, between 7 and 8, those phones did not ring. This was not a rule that anyone had written down or formally announced. It was simply understood, the way certain truths are understood in close relationships through accumulation rather than declaration, through the repeated observation that some things were simply not done. In the 11 years that Jimmy Lee Williams had driven for Bumpy, he had never once heard anyone call those phones on a Saturday evening between 7 and 8. He had heard men say, on more than one occasion, that they would rather call at any other hour of any other day, that the 1 hour of the week that belonged to Bumpy and Mamie was the 1 hour no business in the world was worth interrupting. The apartment smelled of fresh coffee and warm oak floors and the particular perfume that Mamie ordered every month from Bergdorf Goodman on 5th Avenue, her only deliberate luxury in a life that could have accommodated a great many more. The tenderness of this scene, the robe, the glasses, the whispered poetry, the silent phones was not incidental to what would happen later that night. It was its precise cause. Because the softness that Bumpy Johnson permitted himself in this one room, in this 1 hour, with this one woman, was not a contradiction of what he was. It was the clearest expression of it. A man who reads poetry to his wife on Saturday evenings has something worth protecting, and a man who has something worth protecting is, when that thing is threatened, the most dangerous creature that has ever drawn breath on this earth. It was into this stillness that Mamie Johnson appeared in the hallway, adjusting the clasp of her right earring in front of the mirror by the door, and the particular quality of her presence in that moment, cream cotton dress, pearl earrings, the calm and unhurried manner of a woman who had already decided that the evening ahead would be pleasant deserves its own consideration. Because Mamie Johnson was not a woman whose significance derived from her husband's name, and anyone who had ever been in the same room with her for more than 5 minutes understood this without needing to be told. She had been born in 1911 in Macon, Georgia, into a family that treated education and dignity not as aspirations but as requirements, as non-negotiable conditions of a life lived properly, and she had carried this inheritance into every room she had ever entered, including the room she had entered 20 years ago when she decided to marry a man whose occupation she never discussed in polite company. She was 56 years old this October, and she moved through the world with the settled authority of someone who had long ago finished the work of deciding who she was. Not arrogance, something quieter and more durable than arrogance. Gravity, the kind that does not announce itself because it does not need to. People felt it when she walked into a room. Young men on stoops straightened their posture without knowing why. Shopkeepers addressed her with a formality that they did not extend to other customers. Children in the neighborhood called her Miss Mamie with an instinctive respect that their parents had never explicitly taught them, because some things are simply transmitted through the atmosphere, through the simple, repeated observation that certain people carry themselves in a way that makes the space around them different. She was going to bought dinner with Clara Hopkins and Dorothy Moore, two women whose friendship she had maintained for a decade through the particular loyalty that forms between women who have chosen different lives and found, in the choosing, that they understand each other better than women who chose the same. Clara was the wife of a Baptist minister whose congregation numbered 1,200. Dorothy was a schoolteacher who read James Baldwin and argued about him at dinner tables and had remained deliberately, contentedly unmarried in a decade that viewed this choice with suspicion. Three respectable women of Harlem, heading to a new Italian restaurant on Lenox Avenue for pasta and conversation. Nothing about this evening was supposed to matter. It was supposed to be ordinary, pleasant, forgettable. The kind of Saturday night that gets absorbed into the larger texture of a life and leaves no individual mark. Before she stepped out the door, Bumpy looked up from his book and noted the pearl earrings the pair he had purchased at Tiffany & Company on Fifth Avenue for $412 on their 10th anniversary. The pair she wore every Saturday without exception for 12 consecutive years, and something moved across his expression that was not quite worry and not quite tenderness, but some precise combination of the two that only long marriages produce. He suggested Jimmy Lee. She laughed and waved the suggestion away with the easy confidence of a woman who has walked these streets her entire adult life and has never had reason to fear them. The clasp on the right earring had been loose for months. She kept meaning to have it repaired. Tonight, it seemed to hold well enough. It seemed to hold well enough. She pulled the door closed behind her at 7:12 in the evening, and the apartment on 150th Street returned to its Saturday silence. And Bumpy had returned to his hues, and the 4 telephones on the table remained as quiet as they always were between 7 and 8. And nothing about the next 45 minutes gave any indication that by morning the rules of an entire neighborhood would have been permanently rewritten. The restaurant on Lenox Avenue between 126th and 127th Streets had been open for 3 months, and it was, by the standards of what Harlem expected from Italian-owned establishments in 1957, visually convincing. Checkered tablecloths, candles in wax-covered Chianti bottles, a jukebox near the back wall stocked with Dean Martin and Frank Sinatra, the kind of warm, amber-lit interior that made people feel, upon entering, that they were being welcomed into something curated and intentional. A small, imported corner of somewhere else. The pasta, by most accounts, was genuinely excellent. The wine list was surprisingly decent. The owner had invested real money in the illusion of hospitality, and the illusion, for most customers, was sufficient. Vincent Saratelli was 47 years old and believed himself to be a significant man. This belief was the most important fact about him, more important than his age or his appearance or his 3-month-old restaurant or even the criminal operation he ran from the basement beneath it. He stood 5'6" in leather shoes with slightly elevated heels. His hairline had been retreating for a decade, and he compensated for this with a comb-over lacquered into submission, with enough pomade to reflect lamplight. A gold chain, thick enough to be visible through the two unbuttoned buttons of his shirt, rested against the skin of a neck that had grown wider as the years accumulated. His fingernails were manicured with a precision that sat in strange contrast with the rest of him. Rough hands, thick knuckles, the general physical texture of a man who had grown up doing things that left marks, now maintaining in his grooming a single delicate vanity, as if the neatness of his nails could revise the narrative of his hands. He had consumed 3 glasses of grappa since opening the restaurant that evening, and was working toward his 4th with the cheerful momentum of a man who had decided that tonight was going well and that this assessment deserved to be chemically confirmed. His real money did not come from pasta. It came from the basement, where a bookmaking operation handled bets on baseball and horse racing that generated $20,000 a month in turnover. 30% of that went to the Genovese family, one of the 5 families that divided New York City among themselves, with the cold efficiency of accountants drawing budget lines through a lieutenant named Tony Bender. In exchange for this tribute, Saratelli received something worth considerably more than 30% of $20,000. He received a name. The name Genovese, dropped at the right moment in the right conversation, was a force field so reliable that Saratelli had come to mistake it for his own. He wore the protection of that name the way a man might wear a borrowed coat in winter, forgetting, eventually, that the warmth does not belong to him. He had borrowed so much power for so long that the distinction between borrowed and owned had dissolved somewhere in the daily performance of a man who moved through his restaurant with the authority of someone who believed the walls belonged to him, and the street outside belonged to him, and the neighborhood beyond the street belonged to him, and that anyone who entered his establishment did so on his terms and no other terms, and that this arrangement was as fixed and natural as gravity. He was behind the bar at 8:32 in the evening when the 3 women walked in. The young maitre d' stepped forward with menus, smiling, beginning to lead them toward a table by the window, a good table, the kind of table the restaurant offered its better-dressed customers as a matter of course. And he had taken perhaps 3 steps in that direction when Vincent Saratelli emerged from behind the bar and moved to intercept them. Not because he had a reason, because he had a habit. Because in 3 months of running this restaurant, he had established for himself, without any single deliberate decision, a set of practices so reflexive they had become invisible to him, practices concerning which customers received, which tables, and which entrance, and which quality of attention. And because Mamie Johnson, in her cream cotton dress with her pearl earrings, and her 2 well-dressed companions, had walked through his front door on a Saturday evening, and appeared to be heading toward the window. He stepped directly into their path. The maître d' stopped and stepped aside with the trained compliance of someone who had learned not to contradict the man who signed his wages. Saratelli looked at the 3 women, not with particular malice, not with any extraordinary heat with the flat, procedural contempt of a man performing a routine he had performed before and expected to perform again. A man who had organized the world into categories that he had never examined and never intended to examine, and who spoke now from the unquestioned center of those categories, loudly enough that the nearest 4 tables could hear every word without straining. "We don't serve colored at the window. Your tables are in the back, near the kitchen, if there's room." What happened next happened slowly, not because time actually slowed, but because the human mind, when encountering something that reorganizes its understanding of what is possible in a given moment, processes sensation at a different rate. Every person within 15 feet of that exchange would later describe the same phenomenon, the sudden quality of the air, the way the nearby conversations didn't gradually fade but stopped, as if cut by a switch, the way the jukebox Dean Martin singing "That's Amore" with its extravagant romanticism continued at full volume, indifferent and almost obscene in its cheerfulness, the only sound in a room that had otherwise become a held breath. Clara's hand found Mamie's elbow. Dorothy took a half step back. The maitre d' found the floor fascinating. Mamie Johnson did not step back. She did not lower her eyes. She did not perform any of the gestures that Saratelli's experience told him to expect from a woman in her position, in his restaurant in this moment, the slight collapse of posture. The quick calculation of whether a confrontation is worth the evening it would cost. The practiced social retreat that decades of navigating this particular geography of American life had trained so many people to execute automatically, without conscious decision, as a simple survival mechanism. She looked at Vincent Saratelli with an expression that contained no anger, no fear, no plea, and no performance of any kind. Just the steady, undeflected gaze of a woman who had decided, somewhere in her 56 years of living, that her eyes would not be the first to move. "We want a table at the window," she said. Her voice was even, clear, and carried exactly as far as his had. "And we will have one." Something moved across Saratelli's face, a twitch at the corner of his mouth that might have been amusement in a man with better judgment. But in Saratelli, lubricated by 3 glasses of grappa and inflated by 3 months of running his own establishment and 20 years of borrowing the Genovese name, translated into something uglier. He stepped closer, close enough that Mamie could smell the liquor on his breath, the garlic on his fingers, the pomade sitting heavy in what remained of his hair. The restaurant held its breath with him. He gathered saliva in his mouth. He leaned forward, and he spat. Not beside her, not in her general direction, in her face. The impact landed on her left cheek, just below the eye. And what followed was so slow and so public and so irrevocable that the 40 people who witnessed it would carry the image for the rest of their lives, the slow travel of it down her jawline, past the pearl earring, down the curve of her neck, onto the collar of her cream cotton dress, a dark, wet mark on pale fabric. Dean Martin kept singing, "That's amore. The moon hits your eye like a big pizza pie." Mamie did not flinch. Not a single muscle in her face moved. She stood perfectly still for 3 seconds. 4. 5, with the composure of a woman who understood, at some profound and immediate level, that what had just been done to her was not a private injury. It was evidence. And evidence is not something you wipe away in a moment of reflex. Evidence is something you carry. She turned and walked toward the door, upright, unhurried, her pace unchanged. The pace of a woman going somewhere she had decided to go. The right pearl earring, the one with the loosened clasp that she had been meaning to repair for months, that she had worn every Saturday for 12 years, because some things are too precious to leave at a jeweler's bench, even for a day, slipped from her earlobe as she walked and struck the tile floor, with a sound so small that in any other room it would not have been audible. In La Stella at that moment, it rang like a shot. Mamie did not stop. She did not look back. She pushed through the front door and stepped out onto Lenox Avenue, and Clara followed, and Dorothy followed, and behind them the door swung shut on Vincent Saratelli, spreading his arms wide to his audience of 40 stunned, silent witnesses, grinning with the satisfaction of a man who has just demonstrated something he is proud of. "What do they think?" he said, and his voice was loud and warm, with grappa and self-congratulation. "Because they live in Harlem. Harlem belongs to them. Harlem belongs to those who pay the rent, and the rent I pay it." Scattered, nervous laughter from a few tables, the sound of people who are not sure what they have just witnessed but understand, instinctively, that laughing is safer than not laughing when the man who controls the room has made a joke. The bartender resumed polishing a glass. The maitre d' collected the menus from the floor where he had dropped them. The jukebox moved on to Sinatra. Come fly with me. Life in La Stella resumed its surface. Vincent Saratelli returned to his bar stool, poured himself a fourth grappa, and began telling the bartender the story of the black woman who had the audacity to ask for a window table, and the way he had handled it, and the look on her face. He was laughing as he told it. He would still be laughing 2 hours later, at a different bar 4 blocks south, telling a different bartender the same story with additional flourishes. He would go home satisfied, his opinion of himself fully intact, his conviction that the evening had gone well unshaken by any awareness of what had actually been set in motion the moment his saliva touched Mamie Johnson's face. What he did not know, what he could not have known, because it required information he did not possess, was that among the 40 people who had witnessed what he had done, at least 3 were reaching into their pockets not for handkerchiefs or dinner conversation, but for coins, for the telephone booth on the corner of Lenox and 127th, for the number of an apartment on 150th Street, where, at this moment, a man in a burgundy silk robe was reading Langston Hughes in an armchair, the 4 telephones on his table as quiet as they always were on Saturday evenings between 7 and 8. That quiet was about to end. Saratelli would laugh for 4 more hours. He would drink 4 more glasses of grappa. He would tell this story to 3 different bartenders in 2 different establishments, each time with greater satisfaction, each retelling confirming for him that he had done something to be proud of, that the world had been correctly organized by his action, that the hierarchy he had enforced was the natural order, and its enforcement was his right. He did not know that on the corner of Lenox and 127th, a coin was dropping into a telephone slot. He did not know that on 150th Street, a telephone was about to ring for the first time on a Saturday evening in 11 years of Saturday evenings. He did not know that the man who would answer it, the man in the armchair with the robe and the glasses and the poetry, was, at this precise moment, 36 minutes away from hearing every detail of what had just happened in La Stella, and that in the 13 minutes following that phone call, 4 conversations would take place that would dismantle every protection Saratelli believed surrounded him, as quietly and completely as fog dissolves in morning light. He thought the evening was over. He thought he had written the last word. He was wrong. The last word would be written in 7 characters on a white rectangle of cardboard, and it would be pinned, before sunrise, in a place where it could not be ignored. But between this moment and that one stood 13 minutes and 4 telephone calls, and the most precise, most cold, most architecturally perfect demonstration of what real power looks like when it decides to move not loudly, not obviously, not the way that people who have never seen it expect, but quietly, deliberately, with the unhurried certainty of a man who has already decided how the evening ends and is simply attending to the details of getting there. The telephone rang at 9:14 in the evening. Bumpy had moved from Hughes to a chess problem, Fischer versus Reshevsky, a position most grandmasters considered reckless, and that Bumpy considered beautiful, and he reached for the receiver without looking up from the board. He expected Jimmy Lee. He expected business. He did not expect Clara Hopkins, and the moment her voice came through fast, fractured, riding the edge between fury and grief, he set down the chess piece he was holding and listened. He did not interrupt. Not once in 37 seconds. Clara spoke and he absorbed every word, the way deep water absorbs a stone completely. Without deflection, without the surface disturbance that lesser men produce when their bodies receive information their minds are not ready to process. His breathing did not change. The chess pieces remained untouched. The only visible signal that anything was happening behind his stillness was a tightening of his jaw so slight that a stranger would not have noticed it, but that Jimmy Lee Williams, had he been present, would have recognized immediately as the most dangerous thing he had ever seen on a human face. Not because it signaled anger, because it signaled the absolute, irrevocable end of deliberation. When Clara finished, Bumpy asked 3 questions. Low, measured, each word given its full weight before the next was released. Is she hurt? Not physically, but the mark on her cheek, and the way she walked out. The owner's name, Vincent Saratelli. She had seen it on the menu. The address, exact. La Stella, Lenox Avenue, between 126th and 127th. Thank you, Clara. So quietly, so gently, that Clara would tell Dorothy later that night. He thanked me like I had just signed a man's death warrant, and I suppose that is exactly what I did. Bumpy set the receiver down. He sat without moving for 4 seconds. 5. Then he reached across the chessboard and picked up the white king, the piece that represented the player with the advantage. The player the game was designed to protect. He held it for a moment in his palm. Then he laid it on its side. Gently. Precisely. The universal gesture of resignation. Not because he had lost, because he had already decided how the next game would be played, and in that game, there was no question of outcome. He turned to the 4 telephones. What followed in the next 13 minutes was not rage. Rage is loud and imprecise and expensive, and Bumpy Johnson had not survived 30 years in Harlem's underground by being any of those things. What followed was architecture, the work of a grandmaster who has seen the board clearly and is now executing a sequence of moves that were inevitable the moment the position was understood. The first call lasted 40 seconds. Jimmy Lee. The black Cadillac with New Jersey plates, registered to a company that existed on paper and nowhere else. A car built for nights that required anonymity, for movement that would leave no memory by morning. 20 minutes. The second call went to Nat Pettigrew, Harlem's most accomplished information broker, a man who had spent 3 decades collecting the kind of knowledge that people preferred to believe did not exist. Nat heard the temperature in Bumpy's voice before he heard the words, and that temperature told him everything he needed to know. Everything you have on a man named Vincent Saratelli. La Stella on Lenox. 30 minutes, not 40. The third call went to Freddie Parsons, operations manager across Bumpy's lottery network above 110th Street. When Bumpy said quiet work, Freddie understood the full architecture of that phrase without requiring elaboration. No noise, no visibility, no traces that could be followed in daylight by men with questions and badges. The fourth call was the one that could never be fully explained to anyone who had not lived inside Harlem's particular ecosystem of obligation and leverage. It lasted 11 seconds. 1 sentence. He needed 4 blocks of Lenox Avenue surrounding La Stella to have no patrol cars for the remainder of the night. A pause. An answer. Bumpy said thank you and hung up. 11 seconds to remove law enforcement from 4 city blocks. Whatever debt was settled in that exchange, it held. By midnight, those 4 blocks would be as clean of official presence as if they existed in a different city entirely. 13 minutes. 4 calls, a car, an intelligence network, an operational team, and 4 clear blocks of avenue. This was the architecture of a man whose genius was not the genius of force, but the genius of precision, who understood that the most dangerous thing in the world is not the man who reacts, but the man who responds, and that the difference between the two is the difference between a fire and a forge. The apartment door opened at 9:31, and Mamie stood in the threshold. She had not wiped her face in the taxi, not from shock, from decision. The saliva had dried into an almost invisible film on her left cheek, but the skin beneath still carried a faint redness, the ghost of an impact that had not yet finished making itself known. Her right earlobe was bare. The cream collar of her dress held a small dark stain that had set into the fabric the way certain things set permanently, beyond the reach of any cleaning. Bumpy was already dressed. The burgundy robe was gone. In its place, a dark gray suit of fabric so deeply colored it read as nearly black in the lamplight. White shirt, fedora, and gloves, black calfskin. Butter soft on a warm October evening when no man in Harlem had any physical reason to cover his hands. Mamie looked at the gloves. She did not ask about them. 20 years of marriage had taught her to read the vocabulary of his preparation, the way she read everything else about him, through pattern, through accumulation, through the understanding that certain details communicate with more precision than language ever could. He crossed the room and took her face in both hands. Gently, the way you handle something marked and still precious. His thumbs followed the dried path on her cheek from below the eye, across the jaw, to the bare earlobe where the pearl should have been. He studied the geography of what had been done to her with the focused attention of a man memorizing something he intends to answer completely. "Before dawn," he said, his voice unchanged, unhurried. "Every person in this city will understand what it means to disrespect my wife." He held the kiss on her forehead for 3 full seconds. Then he stepped past her and walked out without looking back. Because men who have made their decision do not look back at the doorway. Mamie turned the lock. She walked to his armchair. She sat before the chessboard and the fallen white king. And she waited because this was the arrangement they had kept for 20 years. She did not ask for details. He did not offer them. In that mutual silence lived its own form of trust. The trust of two people who understand each other well enough to know that some knowledge is a burden and some distance is a gift. The back room of Jackson's billiard hall on 143rd Street held a card table. Green felt scarred with cigarette burns, a single bulb overhead, and 7 men who stood simultaneously when Bumpy walked in. Not from courtesy, but from the involuntary response of bodies that had registered the change in the room's atmosphere before their minds could process it. He sat without greeting anyone, removed his gloves, and placed them parallel in front of him, with the care he gave to everything when he was thinking clearly. 7 men watched his hands. The hands were perfectly still. "This evening, Vincent Saratelli spat in my wife's face. Tell me everything about him. Right now." Nat Pettigrew had used his 30 minutes with the thoroughness of a surgeon. What he delivered was the complete anatomy of a man's life. The restaurant was a front. The real operation ran from the basement. $20,000 monthly in bookmaking turnover. 30% to the Genovese family through Tony Bender. 10% to a precinct sergeant whose selective blindness had been purchased and maintained for 3 years. A wife who had left 2 years ago. An apartment directly above the restaurant. And a Saturday night routine as predictable as a clock closed the restaurant. Walk 3 blocks south to the Neptune bar. Drink until 2 in the morning. Walk home alone. Then Nat raised his hand. His voice was careful. "Boss, before you decide, Saratelli pays tribute through Bender's people. If we move on him, we are touching a Genovese-connected man." The room held the weight of that sentence in absolute silence. The Genovese family was not an abstraction. It was 1,000 soldiers across 5 boroughs, judges with obligations, politicians whose careers had been constructed with Genovese money, police commanders who understood which investigations were pursued and which were quietly filed and forgotten. Every man at that table was privately performing the same calculation and arriving at the same conclusion that the rational response was to find a lesser way, a safer way, a way that acknowledged the insult without triggering a war that no one in Harlem could afford to win. Bumpy was quiet for 10 seconds. The clock on the wall marked each one. Then he spoke. His voice had not changed in volume or pitch, but something behind the words had shifted, something that Freddie Parsons would spend 20 years trying to describe, and eventually surrender to a single formulation. It was the difference between a man speaking and a law being stated. Not argued, not proposed, stated. The way gravity is stated, as a condition of the world that exists, regardless of whether anyone finds it convenient. Genovese is not my enemy. Saratelli is not my enemy. My enemy is one thing, only a man who believes he can do what was done tonight and wake up tomorrow morning. That enemy will not see tomorrow morning, and Genovese will send his understanding, because Genovese is a smart man, and smart men do not go to war over a fool who spits at women. He picked up the black billiard ball from the edge of the table, rolled it once in his palm, then set it deliberately in the far corner, separated from all the others. No explanation required. Every man in the room understood it perfectly. What Bumpy did next revealed the quality that had kept him alive for 3 decades, when the average life expectancy of men in his position could be measured in years rather than decades. He did not fight the Genovese problem. He dissolved it. A single phone call at 11:45. 4 sentences. No emotion. To a man whose position in New York's organized power structure sat at a different elevation than Genovese's, entirely a man with whom Bumpy had maintained a decade of mutually profitable arrangement across Harlem's gambling operations. The voice on the other end considered the situation briefly. This, Saratelli, who is he to veto? Really? A pause that contained its own answer. Nobody. A small fish paying through third parties. Vito doesn't even know the man's name. Do what you need to do. If Vito calls and he won't call, I'll tell him his man disrespected the wife of an ally. Vito will understand. We also have wives. 4 sentences to remove an empire's protection from one man's shoulders. The invisible armor that Saratelli had spent years borrowing. The name he dropped in every argument as though it were his own gone. Dissolved in a conversation he would never know had taken place. While he sat on a bar stool at the Neptune bar, telling his story for the 3rd time to a bartender who laughed in the right places. He was unprotected now. He simply did not know it yet. And there is a particular quality to that condition, the condition of a man who has lost everything that kept him safe and continues moving through the world, as though it is still there, that is the most complete form of exposure that exists. Because armor, you know you have lost, you compensate for. Armor you believe you are still wearing walks you straight into the center of the trap. If you had stood on the rooftops of Lenox Avenue that night and looked down, you would have seen a geometry of patience so precisely arranged it approached the aesthetic. 14 people distributed across 4 city blocks, each position so naturally integrated into the texture of a Saturday night in Harlem that the eye passed over them without stopping. A young man under a street lamp on 125th, turning a cigarette slowly between his fingers. 2 men on a brownstone stoop on 126th, sharing a bottle in a paper bag, the occasional low rise of laughter. A woman in a 2nd-floor window above a dry cleaner on 127th, arms folded on the sill, watching the avenue below with the patient attention of someone who has always watched from that window. This last detail was the one that separated Bumpy's thinking from the thinking of men who were merely dangerous. A man standing on a corner at midnight is suspicious. A woman leaning on a windowsill is scenery. She is Harlem. She has always been there, and her eyes miss nothing. Every alley, every passage between buildings, every fire escape on 4 blocks of Lenox was covered. No vehicle could move. No door could open in that rectangle of avenue without being observed by at least 2 of the 14. Freddie reported at 11:50. 14 eyes, No blind spots. Everything in position. Bumpy's answer came back quiet, almost amused. I don't need a mouse. I need the rat with the gold chain. When he moves, call me. Don't touch him. The rest I handle myself. Vincent Saratelli left the Neptune bar shortly after 2 in the morning, 7 grappas warming his blood, walking north on Lenox with the unhurried confidence of a man whose evening had gone exactly as he believed it should. 3 blocks, the same route, every Saturday, for 3 years as regular as a tide, as predictable as a man who has never had reason to vary it because he has never had reason to fear it. He reached the back door of La Stella, climbed to his apartment above the restaurant, changed his shirt from habit rather than intention, came back down, and stepped into the alley. He did not notice the door had not been properly locked when he left. He did not notice the fire escape window that had not locked since July. He climbed the stairs, found his key on the 3rd attempt, pushed open the door of his apartment, and stepped into darkness. Then he stopped, because there was a smell that did not belong to this room. Cuban tobacco aged. Complex. Unmistakable to anyone who had ever encountered it, a smell that announced a presence that had been burning quietly, long enough to settle into the curtains and the furniture and the air itself. His body processed the signal before his mind could formulate the thought. And the processing produced a cold clarity that cut through 7 grappas with brutal efficiency, a clenching in his chest, a sudden awareness of his own heartbeat, a prickling across the back of his neck that was the body's oldest alarm delivering its oldest message. In the darkness ahead of him, something glowed orange, a brief brightening, then a dimming, then a brightening again, the slow, patient pulse of a cigar being drawn. And in that fraction of illumination, just barely enough, the orange light revealed the lower half of a face, a jaw, lips arranged in something that was almost a smile. Don't turn on the light. Vincent. The voice came from his armchair, his own armchair, in his own apartment, at 2 in the morning. With the complete ease of a man who had been sitting there long enough to feel at home. It will be better for you this way. Saratelli's hand froze against the light switch. His fingers trembled on the wall plate. His eyes, adjusting with agonizing slowness, assembled shapes from the darkness, the silhouette in the armchair. Fedora. The steady glow of the cigar, hands resting with absolute stillness on the armrests. And on either side of the room, barely visible, 2 more shapes standing against the walls with the motionless patience of men who have done this before. My name, said the voice from the armchair, with the unhurried clarity of someone who has never needed to raise it to be heard, is Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. This evening, you spat in my wife's face. Sit down. Vincent. We are going to have a very short conversation. The name hit Saratelli like something physical. Every Italian who operated above 110th Street knew that name the way sailors know the name of a reef, not as an abstraction, but as a specific and concrete feature of the landscape. You navigated around, carefully and without exception, his mind, through the fog of 7 grappas, assembled the connection with terrible completeness. The woman in the cream dress, the pearl earrings, the steady, undeflected gaze. He had spat in the face of Bumpy Johnson's wife, in his restaurant, in front of 40 witnesses. His knees found the floor before he made any conscious decision to kneel. I am under the protection of Tony Bender. Veto Genevieve's will. The cigar brightened slowly. The lips held their near smile. Vincent. Bumpy's voice was almost gentle. I made some calls tonight. Vito Genovese does not know your name. You are nobody. You are the dirt on someone else's shoe. And you spent years believing you were part of the shoe itself. Tony Bender is sleeping soundly tonight and has no intention of waking for a man who spits at women. Italians have honor too. Vincent. Some Italians. The conversation lasted 7 minutes. Bumpy spoke about Mamie, not about his reputation, not about his standing, about her, about the fact that she had sat in the taxi the entire ride home without wiping her face, about the fact that she had walked into their apartment and said, "Before anything else, do not do anything. Please." "My wife asked me to spare you," Bumpy said. "The woman whose face you spat in, before 40 witnesses, asked me not to cause you harm. Do you understand what that tells you about who she is? It tells you she is a considerably better person than I am." Saratelli was crying, quietly, without drama, with the tears of a man who has understood too late and too completely what he has done and the impossibility of undoing it. "I didn't know whose wife she was. If I had known," Bumpy leaned forward, just slightly, and the orange glow caught his eyes for the first time. "That," he said, and his voice had the quality of something being carved permanently into a surface that does not accept erasure, "is exactly the problem. You did not do what you did because she was my wife. You did it because she was a black woman asking for a table at your window, a plumber's wife the same, a teacher's wife the same. You spat because of what you are, and what you are is something I cannot forgive." He reached into his jacket pocket and placed the pearl earring on the table between them. The right one, the one with the loosened clasp, retrieved from the tile floor of La Stella at 11 that evening by one of his people, who had entered as the last customers were leaving, spotted the small white sphere, and pocketed it without breaking stride. Such a small thing, barely the weight of a thought, but in this room, on this table, between these two men, it was the heaviest object in the world. Bumpy looked at it for 1 full second. Then he picked it up and placed it in his breast pocket slowly, with the deliberate care of someone filing away evidence that will never be needed in any courtroom but belongs permanently in the record of what this night was. He stood, straightened his fedora, nodded once to the 2 shapes against the walls. "You had the entire evening, Vincent, from the moment your contempt touched my wife's face until right now, to find a different path. You chose grappa and laughter." He moved toward the door, unhurried, the steps of a man returning to the rest of his life. "That choice has been made, and what follows from it follows." The door opened. He stepped through. It closed. The mantel clock on the fireplace continued its ticking into the silence of the room, each tick a subtraction from a balance that was nearly empty, measuring the remaining distance between this moment and the pale dawn still hours away but already, somewhere beyond the Harlem rooftops, making its slow and indifferent approach, in the breast pocket of a man descending a staircase on Lenox Avenue. A pearl earring no larger than a marble rested against dark gray fabric, warm now, warmed by proximity to the body that carried it, beginning without ceremony, the first night of a journey that would last 21 years and end only when the lid of an oak casket closed over it in the summer of 1968. But the story did not end in that apartment. What happened in the 6 months that followed that October night, what shifted, quietly and permanently, across 20 blocks of Lenox Avenue was never reported in any newspaper, never entered into any official record, never acknowledged by any of the people responsible for it. And yet it was, in every way that actually matters, the most consequential chapter of everything that happened that night. Because what Bumpy Johnson changed was not one man's fate. It was the physics of an entire neighborhood. And that change, unlike the man who caused it, proved impossible to reverse. The white cardboard note was gone by the time the first detective arrived in the alley behind La Stella on that Sunday morning. but the 7 words written on it had already left the paper entirely, already passed into the air of Harlem through the particular channels that neighborhoods like this one use to communicate the things that matter, not newspapers, not announcements, but the specific frequency of a whisper, moving from mouth to ear in barbershops and church vestibules and the back seats of taxicabs, carrying the weight of something that everyone who heard it understood immediately and completely, without requiring explanation or elaboration. 7 words. And what followed them was a silence so thorough, so deliberately maintained, that it became its own form of speech. Within 6 months of that October night, something shifted along the 20 blocks of Lenox Avenue that constituted the commercial heart of Bumpy Johnson's territory, something that no sociologist documented, no journalist reported, no city official acknowledged or took credit for. The unwritten policies that had governed which customers received, which tables, which entrances were preferred, which quality of attention was extended to which complexion. These policies did not change loudly. They did not change with announcements or apologies or any public declaration of transformation. They simply ceased. A dry cleaner on 125th stopped directing black customers to a separate counter. A restaurant on 128th began seating everyone at the window. Black women walked into establishments on Lenox Avenue and were greeted at the door and shown to good tables and offered the same warmth that had previously been reserved for other people. And when anyone asked the owners why the change, the answers were vague and unsatisfying, and deliberately so. New city guidelines, modernizing the approach, following the times. The truth was simpler and more permanent than any guideline. The truth was 7 words on a piece of white cardboard, and the understanding, visceral and non-negotiable, that the man who had written them meant everyone. That understanding traveled with Bumpy Johnson for the rest of his life, and so did the pearl earring. It was there through every meeting with every politician who sought his influence and pretended not to know the source of it. It was there on the examining table of his doctor's office in 1962, when the doctor picked it up with casual curiosity and Bumpy took it back with a quietness that ended the inquiry instantly. It was there in 1964 when a young numbers runner, new to the organization and not yet educated in the specific geography of what was permitted, reached down and picked it up from the floor where it had fallen during a meeting, held it out with the helpfulness of someone who does not yet know what he is holding, and saw something cross Bumpy's face that made him take 2 involuntary steps backward before Bumpy said, very softly, "Thank you, and never touch this again." The young man never did, neither did anyone else who witnessed that moment. And the story of it spread through the organization the way all the important stories spread quietly, with the particular reverence reserved for things that reveal the true shape of a man. The true shape of Bumpy Johnson was this. He was a man who carried his wife's dignity in his breast pocket for 21 years because he believed, with a certainty that required no argument and admitted no revision, that a husband who cannot protect what matters most to him is not a husband at all. This belief was not complicated. It was not sophisticated. It was simply absolute, and absolute things, in the long run, outlast everything else. In the summer of 1968, Bumpy Johnson sat down to dinner at Wells' restaurant on 7th Avenue and did not get up again. He was 62 years old. His heart, which had carried 3 decades of weight that would have destroyed most men's bodies within a single one, stopped between one breath and the next. 2,000 people lined the street outside the funeral home 3 days later, politicians and ministers and school teachers and children who did not fully understand why their parents were crying, but understood that someone important had left the world and that the world was measurably smaller for it. Mamie stood beside the open casket in a black dress and one pearl earring, the left one, its twin absent from her right ear for the first time in 12 years of Saturdays. She placed her hand on the breast pocket of his dark blue suit, his best suit, the one his tailor had pressed that morning for the final time. Through the fabric, she felt it, the small, hard sphere, still there, still keeping its quiet vigil. She did not remove it. She left it exactly where he had carried it, next to his heart, where it had always belonged. When the casket lid closed, 2 pearls were separated by 3 inches of oak, the left in Mamie's ear, the right in Bumpy's pocket, a pair divided and indivisible, like the 2 people to whom they had always belonged. Mamie Johnson lived until 2009. She was 98 years old, and she wore her left pearl earring until her eyesight failed in 2005, and she could no longer manage the clasp. After that, it sat in a small velvet box on her dresser beside a photograph of Bumpy in his dark blue suit, taken sometime in the early 1960s, his breast pocket carrying its familiar slight bulge that the camera could not identify but that Mamie could identify from across any room, in any light, at any distance. When she passed, her family found the velvet box. Inside was the earring and a folded piece of paper, yellowed and brittle with age, written in Bumpy's handwriting in the careful block letters of a man who chose his words the way he chose everything, with precision, with intention, with the understanding that what you commit to paper outlasts you. 9 words. A man who did not protect his wife is no man. Below them, in smaller script, for my, always. The family kept the note. They did not share it with journalists or historians or the filmmakers who would eventually come asking. It remained where Bumpy had intended it to remain, within the only jurisdiction that had ever mattered to him. The private jurisdiction of one marriage, one promise, one understanding between 2 people that needed no witness and no record beyond itself. But the lesson the note contained had never needed paper to survive. It had been written into the memory of an entire neighborhood on a single October night in 1957, carved there by 4 telephone calls and a black Cadillac and 14 pairs of eyes on Lenox Avenue, and 1 pearl earring carried 21 years in a breast pocket next to a heart that refused, until its final beat, to forget what it was protecting and why. Real power, Harlem learned that night, is not the thing that makes noise. Real power is the thing that changes a neighborhood so completely, so permanently, that 20 years later, no one can remember exactly when the change happened, only that it did, and that it has never been reversed, and that somewhere at the origin of it stands a man in a dark gray suit and calfskin gloves who asked for nothing and forgave nothing, and carried a pearl in his pocket like a verdict that the world had already accepted before it was ever read aloud.